In this video, we will be talking about how we can find a derivative that involves a chain rule. This is associated with section 3.5, I believe. Actually, in our notes, it's section 3.6. All right, this is the last example that we didn't get to in class, so I wanted to put it on Blackboard here in this video. And so we have the function y equals sine of x squared times e to the x. Notice that this is inside of my sine function, and I want to find the second derivative. Of course, if I want to find the second derivative, I got to find the first derivative. And again, I have a function within a function, right? So this is my inside, and so I've got to take the derivative of my outside first with my inside evaluated at the inside, and then I do the derivative of the inside function, and I'll do that product. And so if I want to find a derivative of this function here, it's going to be y prime equals, well, the derivative of my outside overall function sine, derivative of sine is cosine of x, and so I do the cosine. I'm not just going to put an x here, I'm going to put the function that's on the inside. And so that's the derivative of sine of x squared e to the x. Initially, if I look at the outside, but I've got to multiply by the derivative of the inside function. And that is a product rule because I have the function x squared multiplied by the function e to the x. And so when I do my product rule, this is my first and this is my second. And so if I do the first function times the derivative of the second function, the derivative of e to the x is e to the x. And then I multiply that by and then I have plus my second function, which is e to the x, times the derivative of my first function. The derivative of x squared is 2x. And so my y prime is cosine of the quantity x squared times e to the x. And then I multiply that cosine function by x squared e to the x plus 2x e to the x. And so that's the derivative. That's the first derivative. Now I can do some things, like for instance, I can factor out an x times e to the x. Let's do that, right? So if I factor out an x times e to the x, in this parentheses here, I'll be left with an x plus 2. And that may look more messy, that may look more clean to you guys, I'm not sure, but this is one way I can leave my answer. Your answer is fine here or here. Now that I have my first derivative, I'm going to take my second derivative, and this is going to take a lot of work here. So let's look at my second derivative. When I take my second derivative, let's say I look at this function. This is like 3 functions multiplied by each other. I mean, this is going to be the same thing, but I'm going to look at this one here, and I'm going to take the derivative of this function because I can kind of see one function multiplied by another function, which is here, right? And so if I do the derivative, I got to do the product rule, right? So my product rule says to do the first function, which is cosine of x squared times e to the x, times the derivative of the second function, which is in green here, right? Well, when I do the derivative of that function, I've got to do this derivative and that derivative. This first derivative in itself has a product rule. And so I've got to do the first times the derivative of the second plus the second times the derivative of the first. The derivative of x squared is 2x. And then I got to go do the product rule over here. So I have my first function times the derivative of the second, derivative of e to the x is e to the x, plus the second function, which is e to the x, times the derivative of the first function, which is 2. So what I've done so far is I've done first times the derivative of the second, right? Now I've got to do the second, which is this sum of these two functions, times the derivative of the first. So I'm going to do plus, and then the second function, which I'm just going to copy down, x squared e to the x, plus 2x e to the x. And now I've got to multiply it by the derivative of this first function, which is my cosine. Derivative of cosine is sine. So I'm going to multiply that by negative sine of x squared e to the x. But I've got to multiply that, since this is a chain rule and I'm not just taking the cosine of x, I'm taking the cosine of x squared e to the x. I've got to multiply it by the derivative of cosine of x squared e to the x, right? And so the derivative of x squared e to the x is a product rule in and of itself. So I'm going to have the first function times the derivative of the second function plus your second function times the derivative of the first function, which is 2x. That is a very long expression. But that is my second derivative. Now we can clean that up a little bit. And so I have my cosine multiplied by this entire thing here. Well, let's try to clean that up. Cosine of x squared e to the x. I'm going to multiply. Notice that each of these have and e to the x in them, right? So I'm going to factor out an e to the x, right? And in that first term, I'm going to be left with x squared. The second term, I'm going to be left with a 2x. The third term, I'm going to be left with a 2x. And the fourth term, I'm going to be left with a 2. Okay? In this second expression here, well, I have a minus, a negative sign here. So I'm actually going to write this as a minus instead of a plus. I'm going to go ahead and write my sign of x squared e to the x. And then it's going to be multiplied by, I'm going to go in the next line, this expression, which is x squared e to the x plus 2x e to the x. And I still have it multiplied by this expression, which is the same thing, x squared e to the x plus 2x e to the x. Right, so we can put those together and square them. But what I'm going to figure out here is that I'm going to have cosine of x squared e to the x times e to the x times, well, I can combine these two x's. So that'll be x squared plus 4x plus 2. And then I have minus my sine of x squared e to the x. And if I notice here, there's an e to the x in this expression, there's an e to the x in this expression, and actually, if I really think about it, this expression right here is x squared e to the x plus 2x e to the x quantity squared. Well, both of those terms have an e to the x in them, right? So it's actually like an e to the x times x squared plus 2x, all of that squared. And if I square that, and I have to square that because there's a multiplication between them, and e to the x squared, e to the x quantity squared is the same thing as e to the 2x. I can write that as x squared plus 2x quantity squared. So this last expression down here can be written as a e to the 2x times x squared plus 2x squared. And now that I actually see it, I could have factored out a 2 as well. Sorry, an x as well. And so that would have been a x squared e to the 2x times x plus 2 quantity squared. But that is okay. All right? But that is your chain rule.